Mountain stories. This mountain story with Moses. So Moses spent 40 days and 40 nights on the top of Mount Sinai, reinscribing those tablets, because he threw down the first two in a fit of rage when he found the Israelites had started worshiping a golden calf. On coming down from the mountain, Moses' head shone, and the Israelites were afraid, and they wouldn't come near him until he put a veil over his face. And whenever he spoke to the people, they were afraid because his head shone and he had to cover himself. And he only removed his veil to go and talk with God. A mountain story about Elijah. Elijah was a powerful prophet, and he defeated the prophets of Baal. And when he thoroughly defeated them, Jezebel, the queen, sent Elijah a death threat. And Elijah, surprisingly, was shaken with fear. Even though he had already seen God thoroughly destroy the prophets of Baal, Elijah lost his nerve and he ran away into the desert. And as he was running, he started becoming very hungry. And the angels came and attended him. And he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. And when he got to the mountain, God said, "Go up the mountain. I want to show you something." And when Elijah got up to the mountain, first there was a furious wind, and Elijah cowered in fear, and the violent wind stopped. And then there was a massive earthquake that shook the entire mountain, and Elijah quivered in fear. And then the earthquake stopped. And then a surge of fire enveloped the mountain, and Elijah quaked in fear. But each time, God was not in the wind. God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the fire. And after all these things, there was the sound of a soft but sheer silence. And when he heard the silence, Elijah was no longer afraid. The third mountain story, this one about Jesus, Peter, James, and John. Jesus had just told the disciples that he would have to undergo torture, crucifixion, and would rise 3 days later. The disciples were very confused about this. They did not understand. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up a mountain. There, the veil between the human and the divine was pulled back, and Jesus shone like the sun. His clothes were whiter than the whitest white that bleach could whiten. Then appeared Moses and Elijah with Jesus, and they were having a conversation. What might they have talked about? Did Elijah nod at the disciples and say, "Yeah, you know, the Israelites were as afraid as these disciples. What do you think they're going to do?" And Elijah might have piped up, "You know, I was that afraid. I was that afraid. But then, when I saw God in the silence, I was not afraid anymore." Now, the disciples were not in on this conversation. They were too terrified to talk. The light and the vision was terrifying. It was a terror that bespoke of danger. They were afraid for their lives. And yet, the terror was also attractive. So attractive that Peter wanted to stay with this mysterious terror, and suggested building some dwelling places. Suddenly, a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, my beloved. Listen to him." And in a moment, the veil closed over itself, and everything appeared as it was before. But the disciples were not as they were before. The season of Epiphany always ends with this last mountain story, a dramatic manifestation where the veil is pulled back and the disciples see Jesus' divinity fully revealed. It was Jesus who was transfigured, but it is the disciples who will be transformed. Jesus is who he is, but he is just unveiled. But it is the disciples who will go through an inward transformation from those who did not understand, who were dense and literal and stupefied by this prediction of Jesus' death. Their minds began to unravel, and their minds began to unclench and become more supple. And though they did not fully understand by the time they came down the mountain, they began to make room for the possibility that even in death and torture, one could rise. They began to believe it could happen. They had just seen God. The disciples had just seen God, and amazingly, even in the terror and pain of revelation, they knew something beautiful was breaking through. Unlike the Israelites of Moses' day, Peter, James, and John sought to stay in the presence of what terrified them. In our Sacred Ground class on race this week, we read from James Baldwin. In his essay, he talks about the terror and pain of revelation. In the context of that article, it is the revelation that the history of racism has shaped the white man's identity. And the revelation of this causes great terror and pain. This realization can cause such a surge of guilt that there often follows an overreaction of denial. But Baldwin says that if one remains with this great terror and pain while moving toward what is true, then one can be freed from the tyranny of history. This is true with things other than race and racism. We know the tyranny of things we hide for the shame of it. To imagine pulling back the curtain to unveil these things can shake us with pain and terror. I have heard this from my friends who hid their sexuality and the terror of the thought of being discovered, not just by others, but by oneself. What we learn from the Transfiguration is that behind the veil, behind that thing we so fear, is God. Behind the terror is the still small voice and the land of silence, which is the land of love. When the disciples were most terrified, they heard God speak. "This is my Son, my beloved. Listen to him." And so we are all invited to listen to this story that is behind the veil. which is a story of belovedness, a story of belonging, a story of love. So even though their insight was still veiled as to the meaning of Jesus' prediction about torture, crucifixion, the disciples were moving toward the reality of resurrection. And that somehow behind all this was love. On this Transfiguration Sunday, imagine yourself invited to the top of the holy mountain. Imagine the veil pulling back and revealing not just God, but your very self, enveloped by love. Imagine past the terror and pain of revelation to the proclamation of love. So that when we come down the mountain, we will say, as the Apostle Paul said, "Now we see through a glass darkly, then we shall see face to face." So that all of us with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed in the same image. This is what we do this Sunday and each Sunday that we worship God. Each Sunday and every time we worship God, Jesus is transfigured so that we might be transformed for love. Amen.